Across the Atlantic, the emerging superpower of the United States is simultaneously ahead of its time, yet falling ever more behind. Being one of the world's premier republics, the US stands boldly against the monarchists of the Old World. At the same time, slavery is still an issue of debate, particularly in the South, while most of the great European powers have abolished it. You've got a few different options in America when it comes to their economic and social future, but today we're going to explore a truly forward-thinking America. This will be an America where every man and woman, regardless of creed, ethnicity, language, or any other factor, can find a home. At the same time, we're going to ensure that those homes are well kept and prosperous without compromising on economic development. Today, we're going to create a social democracy the likes of which no Victorian could ever imagine, and in particular, no American of this time could ever comprehend. Today, we're going to create the ultimate consumer economy. First off, what do I mean by a social democracy? Well, the best way to succinctly explain a social democracy without going into too much detail is a political movement originating in the Victorian century that espouses a capitalist economic system with rigid regulations on the market to ensure the well-being of the people. It is harshly opposed to socialism due to its market economy, yet simultaneously opposed to liberalism and libertarianism systems due to its interventionist policies. This essentially left social democracy dead in the water during the 19th century, since neither of the aforementioned economic movements had any love for it. Essentially, if you're an American viewer, this is communism but there's money in private property, and if you're Canadian, this is the NDP. If you're European, this is most likely the economic system you actually live under, and if not, there's probably a party that has this political bent somewhere in your country. Okay, onto the game now though. America. Right now, we're definitely a bit of a problematic nation, what with the slavery and all, so that'll be one of the first goals we're going for. Ending slavery in Victoria 3 is actually extremely easy, to be honest with you, and basically involves the slow undermining of political clout that the landlords have, and the pacification of their radicals. I'm going to teach you something about how civil wars are sparked in Victoria 3 so you can best understand exactly how to avoid civil wars. There are two numbers when a political movement comes up: support and radicalism. Support is the number that corresponds to the total clout of all interest groups that support that movement. This is to give you an idea of how much of the population supports that movement. Higher support indicates that it's something many people, or at least many influential people, will support. Meanwhile, radicalism represents how upset those supporters are about that political movement. This number is based on the count of radicals that form the support numbers. This is why a low support movement can still have immense radicalism, and other times the reverse can be true. Another important detail is that interest groups can only support one political movement at a time. We're going to be using both of these tidbits of information to ban slavery with ease. As you can see here, I've skipped a couple years ahead to my first attempt to ban slavery. We've got about 1 million radicals in the country, and a lot of those are landowners. This means that the radicalism of the preservation movement is high, even though support is low. I'm going to stop trying to ban slavery here since I hadn't realized how radical my landowners were at this time, and I'm going to have to try again later when they're a bit less radical, given that a civil war would be really awful for my country. We'll get there though. For now, let's skip back to the beginning of the game and focus in on our neighbors: Texas, Mexico, and the various natives of the region. Texas can be convinced to join the Republic diplomatically, but quite frankly, I find it to be a waste to even try when they're just so easy to conquer. For this reason, one of our first moves is to destroy Texas. Go ahead and start a diplomatic incident against them with the hope that they'll just back down. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but the big fear is if Britain intervenes, which they do sometimes. Honestly, if Britain defends Texas, just reset. You can defeat Texas and Britain with some smart naval invasions, but quite frankly, it's not worth the effort. While you're waiting for Texas to back down, I'd recommend getting lots of iron and tools on the go, using consumption taxes to fund the construction sectors to make this happen quick. A good rule of thumb is to always build up the goods that you use for construction. The expenses of iron and tools that we spend to build up the country will add up fast, but if we can make iron and tools cheap, then it's no problem. You'll essentially want to do this loop when it comes to building in the early game: iron mines, tools, coal, steel mills. This creates a loop of iron production that cheapens our construction costs, and then tools which can mine the iron, followed by coal, which we'll need for everything later, and steel, which we can use to make more tools. It can be tough to find states to build lots of stuff in, but I recommend the Rust Belt states like Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana, simply because there's lots of iron around there, and these states tend to have infrastructure left over. You can also build down in the south, but the only problem is that we don't want to build in slave states. This is because when we build in slave states, we give more wealth and economic power to slavers. When a building is created, the owners will tend towards certain ideologies as well as the workers. Slaves tend to have almost no political power, so the workers in steel mills in Georgia won't be able to shift our politics much. In places like Ohio, though, we can create more workers that will support the intelligentsia or the trade unions, shifting us towards abolitionism. Later on, we'll invest more in the South. By the way, this doesn't mean that you can't build in the South at all. It just means you gotta prioritize investment in the north. Beyond that, you'll also want to set colonies up in all these native areas around your nation, since many of America's decisions and events have to do with completing their states out in the west. I also went to colonize in South America, but I only did it for the memes. South America's tip tends to have some nice resources, but here in America, we're anything but resource starved. So those are your opening moves as America. Grab Texas, colonize natives, and build up your iron, tools, coal, and steel early on, and to the northern part of the country. Let's run the game a bit now and talk about some of America's flavor. Throughout the game, you'll get events regarding slavery that basically give you pro-slavery or anti-slavery options. These can be pretty cool to read if you're a nerd, but for the most part, you're going to be picking pretty much all the abolitionist options. The game is going to consist of building up more and more of the Rust Belt industries and becoming abolitionist. You'll also have to deal with the Trail of Tears, which is a relatively boring chain of events. You essentially can choose to either have a ton of Cherokee people die, or pay some money and have them move to Oklahoma, with only some of them dying. I can't think of which option is worse. For the sake of our social democracy, we'll of course treat the Native Americans as well as we can, and pay some money to help them live better lives off in Oklahoma. The other big American interaction is Manifest Destiny, which is all about conquering the West Coast and becoming an empire to span both oceans. You can go through and fight Mexico for a state at a time, given that they'll almost always back down against you if you try to take multiple states, or you can do the big brain option, just puppet them. In my opinion, the best way to handle Mexico is always to puppet and then annex them, since it means you can just fight one war against an extremely weak opponent to get everything you need and extra stuff. Given that Mexico actually has a ton of gold, dyes, rubber, and sugar, conquering them genuinely is really good, and it's only about 80 infamy. Your only roadblock will be foreign powers that may interfere. In my case, that would be Britain. We can take Britain though, don't worry. In my case, Britain actually annexed Upper Canada, and I figured it'd be kind of funny to grab the Ottawa Valley off them this war, so I added that as a war goal, as well as war reparations. You're gonna have yourself a two-front war, but the plan is to more or less ignore Mexico while we occupy Upper Canada. Since we have a national militia, we're gonna need conscripts, but we don't want to spend an inordinate amount of money on military supplies, so I'm just going to conscript some southerners in the hope that they are landowners who may die in the war, and some northerners in case we need the numbers. Honestly, I probably conscripted 20 people since this war was easier than expected. Anyway, here's how to beat Mexico. Ignore the front and just invade Veracruz. There won't be anyone there, and hopefully the British Navy will be busy destroying your convoy or something. Do that and you'll instantly win, as you can land in Veracruz and fan out into the Mexican heartland. With that done, you now have Mexico, and in my case, I'll be getting Upper Canada too. Now we just need to wait 5 years, and we can annex Mexico to create a true American empire. All we'll have to do is colonize the bits of native land in the southwest that Mexico didn't get to. The other important detail for this war is that I also built up a bunch of universities around the country, both to increase qualifications and for the innovation. But above all, it was to generate more academics, who would join the intelligentsia. Don't forget that every building you make will, in some form, shape your nation. You'll notice they haven't built any farms or plantations of any kind in this run so far. That's because I don't want more landowners in the country until we've abolished slavery. Anyway, with the war over, we can focus on abolishing slavery, which conveniently has become much easier thanks to a landowner political movement for wealth voting. Remember that an interest group can only be in one political movement at a time. So now that the landowners are busy clamoring for outdated voting methods, we're going to ban slavery under their noses. Abolishing slavery would be pretty easy, since almost all the interest groups are abolitionists, or at least are neutral towards it. I got lucky in that the Whig Party, which Abraham Lincoln leads, got insane momentum in the 1844 election, meaning I can have intelligentsia in the government without tanking my legitimacy. With that, slavery shall be abolished, without a drop of bloodshed. This is something which is honestly kind of disappointing, given how abolitionism should be this huge issue, but alas, it is made trivial through a bit of an exploit. Either way, with slavery abolished, the landowners also lose their pro-slavery trait, meaning now we can build up the South without worrying about empowering them too much. The next big thing to worry about is the Trail of Tears. Ultimately, it's a pretty unimportant issue, but for our social democracy to work, we need everyone to be taken care of, so it simply isn't an option that we allow these poor people to be treated like this. It's time to make amends with both the African Americans and the Native Americans, who at the end of the day are all Americans as far as we stand. In 1846, I began passing multiculturalism. Thanks to the immense number of votes Abraham Lincoln pulled in, the government has been generating immense numbers of loyalists, and because of that, we can pass pretty much any law we want without any group becoming radicalized. Remember that at any legitimacy above 75, you generate loyalists each month. Alongside that, standard of living has been steadily rising thanks to all the jobs I've been creating via the construction sector that's been going since the beginning of the game. When I go to pass multiculturalism, even reactionary groups like the petite bourgeoisie are still loyal, making this law easy. Notice by the way how my intelligentsia have 36% clout. This is most likely because of all the universities that I built before, which created a ton of academics. Once this law passes, the Trail of Tears ends, and now everyone is treated like true Americans ought to. Despite our newfound tolerance, the Canadians seem to be upset that we conquered them before, so they actually rose up in a short-lived rebellion. It seems no matter what we do, the Canadians will never accept that they're actually just Americans, but oh well. A quick rebellion later, and the Canadians are back in the fold. With slavery banned and the Trail of Tears prevented, it's time to build this country into the economic paradise it was always destined to be. And that starts with railways. All those steel mills, coal mines, and iron mines we've been building will come in handy now. We're going to put motor industries across the eastern seaboard, including the southern states now, and then I'm going to put railways down basically in the entire nation. At the end of the day, we'll need them eventually, so even if we're not short on infrastructure yet, it's still a good idea to build them up. As well, I'm going to build a bunch of chemical plants and sulfur mines so we can get fertilizer going. We're going to need lots of food to feed all these people, and the Great Plains will be our breadbasket. As well, we're going to use explosives to make our mines that much more efficient. The nice thing about playing as America is just the absolute glut of raw materials, but the downside is the abysmal population of most of the country. This is actually why conquering Mexico is great for us. Mexico has millions of people in it that we can let fill in the labor gaps of our nation. Oh wait, this sounds kind of familiar. In 1848, we annexed Mexico, and this marks the first 12 years of the game. Not a bad start, honestly. Slavery is abolished about 20 years early, Mexico has been integrated, putting us on the west coast, and our industries are booming as we tap into the natural resources of our nation. From here, we're almost ready to give statehood to the plains and west coast, except we need to fulfill our manifest destiny first. This unfortunately means we'll have to colonize all the native territory that we've yet to do, since the Mexican Cession and Frontier War general entries only complete once that's done. We can make these places states now, but because they're not our homelands, it'll take either 5 years or 20 years depending on if they're Mexican homelands or not. It's better to wait until they get marked as Yankee and Dixie homelands once these journal entries are done. In terms of industrializing the US, your big roadblock is labor. It's difficult to use all your raw resources without the people to work in factories, so I recommend getting technologies like the rotary valve engine, which replaces workers with coal and tools. You're going to want to build up lots of industries like textiles and furniture, because people will be consuming lots of clothes and furniture themselves. Since we're going for a social democracy sort of game here, I wanted to create a consumer economy. If you're not aware, a consumer economy is one where the manufacturers of the nation mostly produce goods that the citizens of that nation buy. Things like clothes, furniture, food, and luxury goods, which do not get traded. This means that we'll be creating a mostly self-sustaining economy that relies on the ever-increasing standards of living to increase our demand, rather than relying on international markets to use our goods. This means we'll be a little bit tariff-starved, but quite frankly, America is so damn rich that you don't need any tariffs. As long as you keep building stuff and keep your taxes relatively low, people will get jobs that give them high enough wages that they can buy all the stuff they need, and we can just lightly tax them to pay for it. Since our buildings are using so much coal and so many tools, we're still going to need to keep making tools and steel. But for the most part, our new focus is to build farms, groceries, and textiles, as well as railways and motor industries for infrastructure. Check out this new president, by the way, Ink Paduda Cocopapi. When you end the Trail of Tears using multiculturalism, you get a Native American president, which I think is really cool. Truly, this man is a worthy successor to Abraham Lincoln. The other big thing to do while industrializing is the Western Frontier expeditions, as we can get the Pacific Northwest off Britain once we do this. I'll be honest with you, I hate the expedition system in this game. I have no idea how it works, if it was completely luck-based, and I don't even know what the point of it is besides the arbitrary need to complete it in order to get Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State. Basically, just click the stuff that gives you progress, but don't click the stuff that gives you peril, and then hope that it ends up working out. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's basically pure luck. You'll have to complete 3 expeditions to get the Pacific Northwest off Britain, as well as having high relations with them. Best luck with the expeditions. I only failed once in this playthrough, thankfully. Okay, so the big roadblock for America is continuing to be a lack of labor. Even the Mexicans can't fill all our labor gaps, if only because they can't migrate in fast enough. This means we'll have to do yet another unthinkable move. We're going to have to get women into the workplace. Now, until women's suffrage fires, we're not going to be able to get too many women in there, but some is better than none. Another thing we can do is acquire more citizens via just a little bit of imperialism. Being that we're America, I figure it's only appropriate that we attack Vietnam, but this time we'll win. Vietnam is a nice target because they have exactly 2 things that America doesn't: silk and opium. Silk we need for luxury clothes, and opium we need for our soldiers. We're going to do to Vietnam what we did to Mexico. We shall puppet them, and then use them as labor. I also started colonizing Africa a little bit, but to be honest with you, there aren't all that many people in Central Africa compared to Asia, so if you're looking for population, Africa isn't that good of a choice. Nonetheless, I did it because colonies are free at the end of the day, and extra land is extra land. I was one of the first nations to get malaria prevention, meaning I got a pretty sizable chunk of Africa all to myself. Back to Vietnam though, France seemed upset at my choice to take what was historically their colonial land, so they backed Vietnam, which was actually a bit scary since France can be quite powerful, but I decided to hold my ground and even grab Guyana and war reparations from France. It got especially scary when my landings in Vietnam failed and France actually landed in DC, Indeed, they occupied a nice area around DC, but I was able to repel them, and then occupy Guyana from there. I kept on invading Vietnam until I eventually got a foothold in South Vietnam. Once I did, I defended there and sent another invasion to Hanoi. Remember that since all their troops are in the south trying to push me out of South Vietnam, they don't have anyone in North Vietnam, allowing me to invade Hanoi without any resistance. Once I landed there, I just sat and defended until I won, and with that, puppeted Vietnam and all its juicy labor. I was thinking about losing to Vietnam intentionally as a meme, but this is a guide series in a way, so I chose to actually win instead. Anyway, with our newfound labor, we can keep building up the country and watch that standard of living and GDP number go up. Your focus should be to give jobs to as many people as possible by creating buildings in places with unemployed people and peasants. Because of all those universities we built, qualifications shouldn't be too tough to get as well. Simultaneously, we also want to move towards universal suffrage since we want our interest groups to reflect our social democratic values. I implemented guaranteed liberties for even higher loyalist generation and to reflect those values too. And now whenever events pop up that empower the trade unions, I'm going to give them more and more power in hopes that they'll become a powerful interest group eventually. I'm not planning to become a communist or a socialist, but the trade unions tend to support most of the policies I'm putting forward, so this will be good for our legitimacy. At this point in the game, being completely honest, the world is your oyster. With Vietnam secured, you now have access to the last raw resources you were missing. With opium secured and rubber plentiful in both Mexico and our new overseas territories, there's no raw resource we don't have. Keep building up your GDP and your standard of living, and you'll create a sort of infinite loop of consumption and production. As we build new textiles and furnitures, that will generate high-paying jobs which make pops wealthier. As those pops get wealthier, they will buy more clothes and furniture, making new factories more profitable thanks to higher demand. This loop continues basically forever, which creates an infinite spiral upwards in terms of both GDP and standards of living. I was lucky enough to get access to even more labor in 1875 when Elizabeth Daniels of the trade unions sparked a suffragette movement. Luckily, thanks to all the support I had been giving to the trade unions, she already had a huge amount of control over the government, and we quickly passed women's suffrage. This gives us even more labor to give out jobs to and continue our consumer economy. In 1876, where in reality America was recovering from a civil war, instead our America had its first female president, Elizabeth Daniels herself, meaning our nation went from Abraham Lincoln to a Native American president to a female president. Truly progressive. The best part about all of this is that the trade unions, when loyal, give even more workforce ratio, creating even more potential workers for all the jobs we're generating. We're sitting at 500,000 GDP and 20 standard of living in 1876 with a population of 50 million. If that's not impressive, I don't want to know what is. Anyway, with progressivism having taken hold of America, it was time to put in a social safety net for our people so that they will always find themselves taken care of even in hard times. There was a political movement for poor laws conveniently, which went forward right away. I have tons of bureaucracy around to use for institutions, and a relatively healthy balance to work with. Although we aren't going to have all that many unemployed people to give welfare to, there will always be some that can use it. More importantly though, we're using it as a stepping stone to get towards old age pensions, since if we do it right now it would radicalize few groups. Think of poor laws as a step towards the actual law that we want. Once that was passed, I also went for workers' protections, since it gives both minimum wage and it removes unsafe working conditions. Those work conditions are quite meaningful actually, since mortality going down means even more workers are available. This isn't all that important for the guide or anything, but I managed to get enough random events to bring up Elizabeth Daniels' popularity to 165. This is pretty ridiculously high. She really should just make a presidential OnlyFans at this point. Anyway, with minimum wages and safety regulations instituted, as well as basic welfare on the rise, we've turned America into a pretty intensive social democracy with a woman at the head, and everyone tolerated regardless of belief or background. The economy is booming, with our GDP heading towards $1 billion, and the people are rich. I just wanted to point out this culture map I got, by the way, during this run. Gosh, it's almost perfect, except for Mississippi and South Carolina. Eventually, these people will get assimilated through the public schools that we have, meaning those outliers will become like us. Assimilation is interesting in that because we have multiculturalism, literally everyone can assimilate to being either Yankee or Dixie, including Afro-Americans. This means the American melting pot is a true melting pot in this world and not an exclusively European thing anymore. As time goes on, the immense wealth this nation is generating has created some 30 million loyalists with only 1/3 of a million radicals. At this point I can literally do anything I want and no one in the country can possibly stop it, simply because the government is truly loved by all. In 1884 we hit $1 billion GDP and almost 24 standard of living. There are less than 100,000 radicals, and the Socialist Party, led by Elizabeth Daniels, continues to rule uncontested, winning 86% of the popular vote. This is where I shall leave the guide. As you can see, America is completely broken, thanks largely in part to their huge raw resources and opportunity to become one of the most prosperous nations around. In terms of other goals for this nation, I don't even know where to go next besides just continuing to raise the GDP and standard of living higher and higher. If you have an idea of where you want this playthrough to go, comment it down below, and I may just continue it, but for now, you get the idea on how to run a social democracy. Essentially, give everyone rights, give everyone jobs, and give everyone a social safety net so that they will prosper and watch the consumer economy grow. Demands for goods, even without trading, will continuously increase, creating opportunity for more and more goods. Our only roadblock will eventually be labor, but we can always get more by just conquering a piece of China. Keep in mind that most Chinese provinces have millions to tens of millions of pops in them. All those pops will have demands that we can fulfill, and they can migrate over to America to fill in labor gaps. This is the consumer economy. This is social democracy. This is America under our glorious leader Elizabeth Daniels. Thank you for watching.